Welcome to the Hastings Shadmehry Show with your hosts, Andee Hastings and Mali Shadmehry. Dive into the heart of family law as Andee and Mali bring clarity to legal challenges, celebrate client victories, and share the wisdom of their combined expertise. Get ready for a journey into empowerment and advocacy right here where your story matters.
Hello, and welcome to the Hastings Shadmehry Show, where we delve into the heart of family law and the stories that shape our lives. I'm Mali Shadmehry, and joining me is the ever insightful Andrea Dyer Hastings. How are you today, Andee?
I'm doing great, Mali. I'm really happy to be here. I'm excited to talk with our folks about the issue that we're going to be bringing to the table today.
I am as well. We're going to be talking about separate property today. But before that, I've got to ask, Andee, today, are you feeling like a warrior or a diplomat, and why?
Today, I'm definitely feeling like a warrior.
Yay, my favorite. Warrior Andee. Best kind of Andee. She's lethal. She's lethal. Okay. Why is that? Why are we a warrior today?
Well, I have a client, a very special client, although I feel like they're all special.
They are. They're our babies. Even when they're bad boys and girls, we still love you.
Absolutely.
Pay your bill, though. Sorry.
We do this all day. So, I am feeling like a warrior today. I have this very sweet client, older client, had been married. His first wife passed away, and he had accumulated a lot of assets and married a second time, a much younger woman. And she didn't come into the marriage with a lot of assets. And to some extent, he's been manipulated, unfortunately, by his spouse during the course of the marriage. And now they're going through a divorce. And it is my job to put the force field around him and fight for him, fight for what he had prior to the marriage, that he can keep it. He wants to have assets that he earned in his first marriage to pass on to his children. That's a common concern, and I want to fight tooth and nail to make sure that he does.
Oh, I love that. I know the client you're talking about. He is just precious, and that is going to correlate to what we're going to talk about today, separate property. I actually have a consultation with a client later today that has been married for 50 years. So he's an older client as well. And when we're dealing with that, we deal with a whole new can of worms than you do with some of the shorter term marriages. Okay. But today I'll say I am definitely a warrior today. Definitely a warrior today. And that is because I have trial set for every Monday in December 4th, 11th, and 18th. I believe those are all Mondays.
They are.
And my mind is just in battle mode. I am so ready to go deliver. We're not quite there yet, but I'm in the middle of prep to be ready for those hearings. And believe it or not, those hearings, they're trials, they are all for the same case. We're going for different issues on those Mondays. So I am fully invested and ready to go fight. Can't wait. Today we're going to be addressing the concept of separate property versus marital property and what that means, and some standard tips and information to educate you guys. And so before we delve into that, Andee and I are just going to share a couple of stories that correlate to what separate property is, per specific cases we've had in the past. Do you want to start or me?
I can start.
Okay.
I have had, I don't know how many cases that involve separate property. And one of the things that comes up a lot, it's either assets that somebody brought into the marriage or assets that they inherited either prior to or during the marriage, that are by definition separate. And often the question that I deal with, and I'm sure you do as well, Mali, is that have they maintained the separate character? Have they done the things necessary to protect those assets from becoming marital property? And there are things that our clients do to protect them, and sometimes they just don't know. And unfortunately, by the time they get to us, they've already perhaps changed the character of what was their separate asset into a marital asset. Is that something that you see in your cases?
It is. I'm actually going to tell a quick story to lead us into the specifics of separate property. So I had a client that I went to court one day, just average day in court, Forsyth County, Georgia. And I did a hearing for a sweet client. I remember she was in her 70s. We got done. I was seeing her out. She was all nervous. I remember pretty much having to hold her hand to get her out of the courtroom. And this huge guy comes up to me. He's in a suit and he's frantic. And he's like, "Ma'am, I have trial in 1 hour in this courtroom and I don't have a lawyer. I need a lawyer." And I'm like, "Huh?" And I'm like, "What are you going to tell? You're not going to set me up to go look terrible in front of this judge." But I felt bad for the man and I had an intuition about him. I'm like, I said, "Let me see my client out and I'll be right back." So I go get her out the door, get her on the elevator, see her out. Go back to this man and he's surrounded by people in the hallway. And I'm like, "Excuse me, he has trial in an hour. What is going on?" And he was a professional athlete and I didn't know that. But these people recognized him and we're talking to him and I'm like, "Okay, all right, cool, sit down. Tell me what's going on." Long story short, he tells me the story of what's been going on. He's been married for, I remember, 20 years probably, and acquired all these assets. And essentially, his wife wanted to get a restraining order against him. And in Georgia, you can do that and also basically get alimony and all kinds of stuff within the context of a restraining order. So he had a restraining order trial. And that was the trial. That was an hour away. So I hear his story and I trusted him. I did. I said, "I think he's telling me the truth." And I know there's another lawyer there. She's got all these exhibits. Everything's prepared. I have him retain me in the hallway. He pays the firm and whatever. And we are ready to go. I am scribbling on one little piece of paper. It's this crumpled up piece of paper, my whole case. I'm learning the case in an hour. And I'm like, "Okay, here we go. Here we go." So they line up their exhibits and they, they're all ready. And there I am with my one little piece of paper. And my client that trusts me, and even the judge was like, "Miss Shadmehry, you're representing him?" I'm like, "Yep, I'm ready." And I remember the other lawyer was so rude to me. And I remember saying, "Hey, I think we should talk about settlement before we do this trial." And she was like, "No." My client was crying over the weekend. I will never forget that. And I'm like, "Oh, she was crying? How novel." And this lawyer refused to talk to me. And that was fine. We went to trial, where we won. We put up all this evidence, and even the judge was like, "There's not been domestic violence. I'm not granting a restraining order. Get over it." And we won. I remember my client picked me up off the floor, basically hugging me, and he was so excited. Well, these people decide to stay married. Okay, so they stay married after this trial where she tried to get the restraining order and failed. But he comes back to me in a couple of years and says, "All right, we need the divorce now." So we do the divorce. Now, what he should have done was probably get a postnuptial agreement, which is like a prenup, but you can enter into a postnup after you're already married. And we'll talk about that again in a moment. But he didn't, and so they stayed married, and we do the divorce. We get them divorced. And then he comes back, and he says, "I got a new girl. She's great, but let's do a prenup this time." Because he had acquired so many assets prior to meeting this new lady that he wanted to protect his assets, his separate property. Separate property we'll talk about. Those are the assets you acquire prior to the marriage for the most part. And so he wanted to do a prenup smartly so that he could protect the assets that he was now bringing into this new marriage. We already got divorced once and that was dramatic. And so he wants to do the prenup. So we do the prenup for him. And he ended up breaking up with the lady before they got married. And then he had to have me go after her to get the engagement ring back, which is a different topic too. So we were very involved together. But here's why that correlates to separate property, and we'll delve into that. When you have established yourself, myself included, I think about this for me. I'm not married. People always want to ask me that. I'm not. But when and if I do get married, I want to do a prenup. I'm 34 years old. I've been working for a long time, it feels like to me, and acquired assets and generated some wealth for myself and whatever. And I want to protect that for myself. That's what I've earned prior to having a teammate in a marriage to build things with me. So there should be a line in the sand there. And that's a personal decision for people, but you might want to protect that. So for people that have been grinding and building all this time, and then you're going to get married, you need to have a serious conversation with a lawyer and with the person you're going to marry to determine how we're going to handle that. And it is a big red flag. Might sound like an obvious statement, but I think some of y'all need to hear it. It is a big red flag if you try to have these conversations with your person you're going to be marrying, and they're balking at it, and they're defensive, and they're angry. Y'all have got to be able to talk about finances, and we know it's not like a sexy topic, but we need to normalize that. One of the biggest causes of divorce that I see is people just not communicating well, and finances are a big component of that. And if you can be upfront before on this non-sexy topic and treat the marriage a little bit like a business transaction so that you're communicating well, expectations are real, then we understand what we're protecting and what means something to someone versus someone, and what is the separate property I want to protect. So with that, do you have any cases you've had where there was big separate property and caused a lot of issues? And let's just get into that topic. Let's talk about what is separate property.
Well, I have several right now, as a matter of fact, that involve that. But absolutely, I'm thinking of one in particular in the past, and it also involved somebody in the media spotlight. And this was a later life marriage for both of them. And this actually involved royalties on creative content that one spouse brought into the marriage. But they worked together as a team during the marriage. My client supported the other, and they actually collaborated to create creative content. So I'm actually going deep difficult. And I know that's not what you're asking for. This is the most complex type of potential separate property case, because delineating, what was separate and what was marital in a case like that was particularly difficult. We were able to do it. The client had an outstanding result, and she's living a beautiful life. We're friends to this day.
Oh,
actually.
I love it. I know who you're talking about.
I know you do. She's very special to me, too. I'm saying that about all of them, and it's true. But, like, for instance, I mentioned a few moments ago about a client we have right now, substantial assets, property, accounts, retirement, that he has brought into this marriage. And we're fighting about all of it because the other side convinced him to perhaps change the character of some of the property into marital property. There are still arguments that can be made with regards to that. But she's also abusive, and she's accustomed to getting her way. And so my job is to also protect him emotionally so he just doesn't fold and just give her whatever she wants so she'll stop hurting him emotionally. So that's a whole nother piece to the argument. I'm going off on a tangent, but
we love tangents. So what I'll say pertaining to this concept of separate property, like, what is it? And especially if you're somebody you brought a lot of money into the marriage, or you're considering that, you need to listen to this. If you're already established and then you're going to be getting married, you need to know this. Or if you're the person marrying someone that's more established, you need to know this and learn so that knowledge is power. We believe in love and marriage, and we've plenty of clients that reconcile and all that. And so what I tell people is, look, if you don't want to do a prenup and whatever, good. If that's the decision y'all make, great. But you at least need to know how this works. So that's kind of what we're giving you right now. So here's what I kind of tell everybody, very layman kind of approach to, like, what does separate property mean? So in a divorce, we have to look at what is in the marital estate, okay? The marital estate, that's not the separate estate. Separate property is different from marital property. So equitable division is a concept, and what that means in Georgia is equitable division means, what do we do with the marital estate? What do we do with all the stuff, the assets and the debts? And in Georgia, we're an equitable division state, which means fair division, equitable, fair. We are not an automatically 50-50 division state when we're dividing assets and debts. And we'll talk about that specifically more on another episode. Lots of factors that go into that. But we always have to do a threshold analysis of what comprises the marital estate. Those are assets and debts that have been acquired during the marriage. From the date of marriage to present, assets and debts that have been acquired for the most part. And then you've got this concept of separate property. Separate property can be defined as assets and debts that were acquired prior to the marriage, as well as any and all growth on those assets or debts, however you want to define that, during the marriage. But
Due to market forces and not work during the marriage.
That's right. So let's talk about that. What does that mean?
So like, for instance, let's say you have a premarital home and you've got all this premarital equity in the home. When you get married, you start paying the mortgage from money that's earned during the marriage. The point at which you start doing that, you are creating a marital interest in what is otherwise your separate asset. And then, of course, with real estate, it's the obvious example. You have market forces that are at play at all times when you're dealing with real estate. So let's say you get married and you start paying some of the mortgage with money that you earn during the marriage. And then it also increases in value as a result of, I mean, we can look in the market today and know that that happens every single day as a result of the real estate market. So at the time of the divorce, the calculation is to figure out what part of the interest of this house is that party's separate interest versus the marital interest. It's going to involve something called it's a Thomas calculation. And it takes into account all of these different factors. What was the value at the time of the marriage? How much equity was there at the time of the marriage? What's the value now? Is that all due to market forces? Was there a big renovation that the parties did during the marriage? That's not market forces. That's marital effort. So it can be very complicated, but that's one example of how market forces can drive the value. And then we have an expert, typically we'll have an expert who will pull that apart. And
who is the expert? Like, what does that mean?
Oh, that's a good question. There are various forensic accountants that we use in a lot of our cases, and they'll come in and they've got a background in finance. Often they've got a background in tax. Obviously, they're CPAs, and so they will analyze the assets, and if there is a separate property claim, they will assist in calculating what is that claim, what is the value of that separate property or the separate portion of that property.
Yeah, I think that we use forensic accountants in the vast majority of our cases. I think that's kind of a thing that y'all could take away with you. If you have a higher net worth estate, like, you're going to have a forensic accountant involved, an expert in your case. That's very normal, and that's a good thing. And your lawyer should talk to you about that in your consultation. That would be factored into the entire game plan and the cost of your case and all these things. But let me ask you, Andee, can you talk to us about like retirement and pensions and like walk us through how those work in the realm of separate versus marital property?
Yes, we deal with retirement accounts all the time when it comes to separate property. It's not unusual for people to have, worked in a job and accumulated a retirement account prior to the marriage. And let's say there's different fact patterns we see. But they had a retirement account with a job that they had prior to the marriage. They have a new job. They're acquiring retirement during the marriage. So as to that previous retirement account, it's probably going to grow. And this is another example of market forces. So provided that they didn't either take that premarital retirement account and roll it over into an account holding marital retirement monies, they've maintained the separate character. The growth in that account, even if it was during the marriage, the market forces that have been in effect on that account are also separate property. We see that all the time. We deal with it with pensions. Pensions are their own little beast.
Yes.
We also often have to get them valued, present day values. And
by the experts.
Yes.
Yeah, the experts need to value those for sure.
For sure. And again, when it becomes a little bit trickier is when, let's say in this example, our client has a job. They contributed to their retirement for 14 years prior to the date of the marriage. And inside the marriage, they've contributed for another 10 years. Or same thing with pension. That's going to require analysis by an expert so that we can determine what portion is separate versus what portion is marital. Mm-hmm. We do it, I feel like, every day.
Yes. The retirement, the pension, and then the equity in the homes are the most common probably that we see kind of components pertaining to separate property analyses that need to be done in our cases. Things will get real fun and complicated when we've got a business. Can you walk us through that? What would be concerns pertaining to separate property if somebody owns a business?
Well, it depends on the nature of the business. In my experience, if you had a business prior to the marriage and it developed a product, for instance, and you continued to work in that business and sell that product during the marriage, then you're going to have the same analysis performed by an expert as to, they basically have to go back to a snapshot in time and try to figure out what the value was of the business at the time versus what it is now. And there's all kinds of factors that they look at. That's a very specific type of example. Sometimes, although people have businesses prior to the marriage, the business is them. Like if they're a consultant, mm-hmm. Then the value of the business is their work and who they are. And those mm-hmm. cases can become much more complicated to pull apart from a separate versus marital component. And we absolutely use experts in situations like that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is, the more complex the situation is with a business, we aren't probably even formalizing what our approach is going to be in settlement negotiation or of course a final hearing or anything like that until we powwow with the expert and we really start to gel. Okay, what's our approach here? And let's weigh how in depth do we need to go from a cost perspective? What are we looking at? Does the potential value, when we do a kind of a threshold analysis of this business, does the potential value even warrant spending more money to go down this rabbit hole of really going down a separate property path? So like the takeaway there is you just need an attorney that specializes in high asset divorce, represents business owners, and works with these experts frequently because it's not just your lawyer that's going to work out the game plan at that point. But another common one that comes up a lot is inheritance. Let's talk about that. Give us some pointers and knowledge about how inheritance works.
So we do have that a lot, especially with our older clients experiencing the loss of their aging parents. And I've got one right now who inherited a fairly large estate after the passing of his father. And he has done what I would have told him to do had he come to me at the time that he received the inheritance. So he has maintained the separate character of this asset. And by that I mean there are different pieces to it. There were real estate components, there was a retirement account, there were investment accounts, and each one of those assets, when he received his portion, he opened an account in his individual name. He took the proceeds from the sale of the real estate, put it into that account. The retirement, he's kept it in an account in his individual name, rolled it over. And same thing with the investment accounts. And so now he's unfortunately facing a marriage, and his soon-to-be ex-spouse
facing a divorce.
Oh, yes. Thank you. See, this is why we work so well together.
Yes.
She knew what I meant. So facing a divorce, going through a divorce, and his spouse doesn't seem to understand why she's not entitled to half of those assets that he acquired from the inheritance from his father. And obviously we understand implicitly why she's not entitled to half. But one thing to keep in mind is that when one party has an inheritance, that amount, so he's got an inheritance over here, the marital pot is over here that's subject to division, equitable division. the court could consider what he has in his separate pot when dividing what's in the marital pot.
Yes, because equitable, again, means fair. And the court is allowed to look at a lot of different things to determine what is fair when looking at the grand scheme of the full financial picture of both parties. If you received $1 billion in inheritance, then is it really fair that the other party is going to walk with $40,000 from a marital or estate? It's just that is a very fact-specific question, and the fact finder, the judge, or sometimes the jury in Georgia, in Georgia we can have jury trials or bench trials with a judge. It's really up to the fact finder and how good your lawyer is in order to really argue what looks fair in the situation. So what happens if I'm married and I get some inheritance during my marriage and I put that into an account in me and my spouse's joint names? What happens to the inheritance if that happens?
That is an example, Mali, of someone taking what is otherwise a separate asset and changing the character of it to marital. When you put it into a joint account, you have basically gifted that asset to the marriage.
And at that point, then, is that inheritance subject to being split between the parties?
Yes.
All right. So what do you recommend to clients when they receive inheritance during a marriage? What's the pointer there? What are the must-dos to protect that money and keep it separate?
Exactly what I was talking about before with reference to the client that I mentioned. If you receive inheritance during the marriage, no matter what it is, create a separate account. And I know this seems a little silly. It's not necessary, but do it at a different bank. Don't even do it at the same bank that you and your spouse go to every day, just to make it so clear that there's no way that this has anything to do with the marriage. Put whatever funds you receive, if it's an investment account, create a new investment account with your advisor, move the money into that account, but keep it in your individual name. And do not take money that you have earned during the marriage and add it to that account. So, for instance, you get an inheritance, you put it into your own investment account in your individual name. You have maintained the separate character of that asset. But let's say you sell a house and you get $50,000. You take that $50,000 and the house is marital and you stick it in that account, then you've done something called co-mingling the funds. So that becomes another issue, another battle when determining separate property when you commingle funds, because you can't point to a specific dollar in an account and say, well, this dollar I put in is my separate property, but all these dollars that I put in over here are marital. It's not that simple, and you've compromised the separate character of your asset by doing that.
Yeah. One other sort of common component that we see that is correlated to separate versus marital property is gifts. What if you receive gifts during the marriage? How are those treated?
It depends. So, for instance, a lot of times parents will gift whatever goes up to the threshold, the taxable threshold for a gift, so that they can start basically pre-dividing their estate and giving it to their children. So let's just say your parents, each one of them gives you $10,000. You need to preserve that. That is a gift. If it's clearly intended to be given to you, then you need to preserve the separate character of that. So if it's a check that's written out to the both of you and you want to claim later, well, that was a gift from my parents, and so that should go to me, the court's going to look at what was the intent of that gift in order to determine, is that reasonable? So if it's a check that's written out to the two of you, likely the court's going to interpret that the gift was to the both of you. If it was to you individually, it's going to likely be interpreted as a gift to you individually. But then remember, you have a responsibility to maintain the separate character of that money. If you just take it and put it into a joint account, then you have destroyed the separate character of it. One thing I thought of a minute ago that I didn't tell you, Mali, is one question that clients ask me a lot, and I don't know if they ask you this, is, well, what if I have a separate property account and I pull money out of that to say, put a deck on our house, and that's marital? What happens to that? taking money out and spending it whatever way you will on the marriage, give it to the marriage, doesn't change the character of the account itself.
Correct.
But the money that you gave to the marriage has become marital.
Yes. Okay, I almost forgot what I was going to say. I had pop up recently in a case. My client was wanting to say, well, he bought me this car during the marriage. He gifted that to me. That should be my separate property. And in Georgia, that's not how it works. He gifted that to the marriage in that occasion. So if your spouse gets you a gift in Georgia, that's still treated as marital. That's just a little snippet, Georgia specific. Not sure on other states how they treat, your spouse is giving gifts. If it's gifts that you've had, you brought into the marriage, things you brought into the marriage, like furniture, things like that, those are separate. That stuff you automatically take with you. But it really does go to the intent. So I've hit on this concept of prenups and postnups. So can you talk to us about that? Like, how can you use prenups and postnups to protect yourself, and do a quick walkthrough of that?
So prenups and postnups, like Mali mentioned earlier, are very similar. One just is something that you enter into prior to your marriage, and one is something you enter into after the date of your marriage. But you can delineate in a prenup or a postnup how you want your assets treated. So you can say in a prenup, for instance, let's take that retirement account that you'd already been building prior to your marriage, but you're still in that same job and you're still going to earn money that's going to go into that retirement account after the date of the marriage. In a prenup, you can designate anything that I earn in that account is my separate property, if y'all can agree to that. You can also delineate that anything earned after the marriage is marital, which is actually comports with the law. If you didn't have a prenup, you'd still need to do a Thomas analysis. So some things you can do in the prenuptial agreement is you can designate, you can pick a value and say what your separate interest is at that time, if that makes sense. So, you just have a lot of different options to protect your assets.
I believe, and what I've seen is that, first of all, if you're going to do a prenup or a postnup, you have got to get a family law attorney that specializes only in family law to do this. Prenups and postnups, they're very particular little critters. And if they're done improperly, even in the most minor of ways, they can be set aside. They can actually create more mess than order. But if one is done correctly, and you go to the right lawyer to get one done correctly, you need to be doing it well before your wedding. Do not do it on the eve, okay? That's just a whole nother can of worms. And it's easier to set them aside the closer you do it to the date of the wedding. You've got to plan this out. There's all these, we could talk about that in a separate show for you, but.
I could talk about prenups all day. I can.
Yes, Andee is our prenup queen. But I tend to get bored with them because I want to be in court. I don't want to be here drafting words. Just kidding. I'm good at that too. But if they're done properly, in the hopefully off chance that you're going to get divorced, if they're done properly, your divorce should be more orderly and cheaper if you've done a really good prenup. It should just show, it helps us get to the point more. There's probably still some more negotiating that needs to be done, but it's just an extra layer of protection and order in an already really challenging time. And one thing I'll bring up, a good family law attorney, we bridge the gap between emotion and business. A family law attorney is not here to be your therapist, and we will get you to the right therapist. And we do a lot. A lot of my clients will say, Mali, you're more like my life coach than anything. And we do. We are helping you move into a new chapter. You're going through a metamorphosis. We find that that's a beautiful part of our job. We're helping you get to this new chapter. But it's really our job to help you make smart business decisions with your life, help you be savvy, be smart about these decisions. And like I just said, we're helping you bridge the gap between emotion and business. And that's a really unique part of family law. I mean, these issues of the heart with your spouse and family, and then you combine money and all this, it is very hard. Even if you're very well versed in business, when emotion becomes involved, your judgment becomes clouded, and that's okay. That's why we exist. That's part of what we love to do. Make order out of this just heartbreak for you. And it's a hard conversation. Like if somebody's parent dies during a marriage and you're getting inheritance, and then to have that discussion about, well, I'm putting the money in my separate account, and then somebody's feelings gets hurt. I mean, that's difficult. And it's wiser for the well-being of your entire family, your well-being as a human in general, to help y'all navigate these potentially really tough times. Doing a prenup to already say, if I get inheritance, it's mine. Then y'all have already addressed that before it even happens during the marriage. So I see prenups as like potentially a savior of a marriage, just helping like have solid communication and boundaries that are already in place before these really emotional times happen. So it's a great planning tool to actually preserve your marriage. And I absolutely think it's a big red flag if somebody's getting defensive at a conversation about a prenup and about money. You need to seriously think about that. I think that it's okay if you don't have a prenup or a postnup as well. Like if you need to have hard conversations about, look, like I got this inheritance, I'm going to put it in my own account. And here's why. If I think if your spouse is bucking up at that, that is a huge red flag. And it's probably about time, if that's happening, for you to go talk to a lawyer. And you don't have to tell them you're doing that. You're not coming to a divorce attorney to get a divorce. You might just want to get educated at that point. And I have people that come to me like, look, things don't feel right. We're having hard money conversations. That's when I'm talking to them about, look, it might be time to do a postnuptial agreement that if we get divorced, here's how we want it to happen. So like, that's kind of a thing for me. When I've got somebody that's on the fence that comes to me and they say, I want a divorce, or I think I might want a divorce. I don't know, but I know something's not right. And a lot of times it's surrounding money. And it's because they haven't had these conversations from the rip. Like, what do we do with separate property and all of this? I'm usually saying, look, if you're on the fence, I'm just here to educate you so that you can use the knowledge I'm giving you to make the right decisions for you and your family. And you don't have to make any decision today. I'm just here to educate you because knowledge is power. And when we're bridging the gap between emotion and business, you need the knowledge. That's what's going to help you sort through that to make the best decisions for you and your family. And I'll usually be given them the option then of like, look, you can do a postnuptial agreement if that would make you feel better. And it's the same thing as a prenup, but you're just already married and we can enter into it after. But that's again, a whole nother can of worms about prenups and postnups specifically. I think we've covered separate property a good bit. Anything else you have to share I think we've hit the big things in my mind that people usually ask about with separate property.
The main thing, and we are going to have to talk about this in another episode, I have very strong beliefs in this day and age, especially with the changing view of alimony, that, and this goes to both men and women, if you are considering giving up a career to raise children for the benefit of your family, you should consider a postnuptial agreement at that time. Mm-hmm. That's my welcome to my TED Talk. We can talk about that later.
Yes, agreed. Well, thank you all so much for joining us again today, and we will see you next time on the Hastings Shadmehry Show.